Hello, this is the creator of Touched by Grace. Every story on this channel is written and edited manually. Nothing here is automated. Each video is crafted with care. Thank you for being here.
Snow hammered the dark woods of Vermont that night, piling against windows and swallowing every sound. Inside a small wooden cabin, a 78-year-old man sat alone, half awake, half frozen, believing Christmas had nothing left to offer him. Then, just as his vision blurred and his breathing slowed, a voice cut through the storm, his name. Spoken softly, spoken lovingly, spoken in the exact voice of the woman he had buried 6 years earlier. He tried to stand, thinking he was dreaming. But the voice came again, clearer this time, calling him toward the front door. And when he opened it, what he saw on that snow-covered porch would make him collapse to his knees, because no storm, no darkness, and no grief could explain the figure waiting for him in the light. For 6 long years, the old man had lived in a silence deeper than winter itself. His cabin sat at the edge of a small Vermont town, surrounded by pine trees and heavy memories. Ever since his wife Margaret passed away, the world had felt dimmer, almost hollow. He once played guitar at church, once stayed after Mass to help set up the nativity scene every December. But after losing her, he never stepped inside again. He told people he was fine, but everyone in town knew the truth. Grief had wrapped itself around him like a second winter. Christmas, once their favorite season, had become unbearable. Margaret loved decorating the porch with white lights. She said it made their home a beacon of hope. Now those lights sat in a dusty box, untouched. The old man spent most evenings listening to the wind and avoiding the photographs on the wall. And as the year's first big snowstorm rolled in, he felt the familiar ache settle in his chest, an ache that whispered the same bitter thought he had repeated since the day she died. God took everything from me. By late afternoon, the storm had swollen into something fierce, one of those Vermont blizzards that locals respected the way sailors respect the sea. Snow whipped sideways across the hills, rattling shutters and burying fences in white. Radios across the county repeated the same warning: stay indoors, roads will close soon, temperatures will drop sharply by nightfall. From his window, the old man watched the world disappear inch by inch. The pine trees blurred into pale shadows. The porch railing vanished beneath the drift. Even the faint glow from neighboring homes dimmed and then went out entirely as power lines sagged under the weight of ice. Inside the cabin, the cold crept in like a living thing, slow, patient, determined. The old man wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, but a deeper shiver ran through him, one born not only from the cold, but from the knowledge that he would face another Christmas alone. The storm howled, vibrating the thin walls. It felt as if the entire world were folding in on itself, sealing him inside a tomb of snow and silence. And somewhere beneath the roar of the wind, a quiet dread whispered that tonight might be more dangerous than any winter he had ever known. Night fell early, swallowed by a wall of snow so thick it seemed to erase the sky itself. The old man tried to keep busy, adding wood to the stove, checking the flashlight batteries, heating a small pot of soup, but the storm pressed harder and harder, shaking the windows like giant hands. Then, with a brittle snap somewhere along the hillside, the lights in the cabin flickered, stuttered, and died. Darkness swept in instantly, heavy and absolute. The old man froze, listening. No hum of the heater, no soft buzz of the lamp, nothing but the roar of the blizzard outside and the creaking of the rafters above him. He lit a candle, but its flame trembled violently, struggling against the cold that seeped through every crack in the cabin's walls. Within minutes, the temperature dropped enough that he could see his breath drifting in pale clouds. His fingers stiffened, his chest tightened. At his age, this kind of cold was more than discomfort. It was danger. He shuffled toward the stove, but the wood he'd added wasn't catching, Heat faded. The cabin felt less like a home and more like a forgotten outpost, swallowed by winter. And for the first time in years, a quiet fear, real fear, settled over him. As the cabin dimmed to nothing but the weak glow of a single candle, the old man eased himself into his worn armchair. The cold pressed against his bones, but it was the silence that hurt him more, the kind of silence that makes memories speak louder than the wind. He stared at the mantel where a row of picture frames sat in shadow. Even without seeing them clearly, he knew exactly which one stood at the center. Margaret in her winter coat, laughing as snowflakes clung to her eyelashes. She always said winter was the season when God painted the whole world clean. He used to believe her. But after she was gone, every snowfall felt like a reminder of what he had lost, and of the prayers that went unanswered. He remembered holding her hand in the hospital, begging God to give them more time. He remembered the helplessness, the silence, the final breath. And he remembered the anger that rose in him like fire, a fire that never burned out. Now, wrapped in blankets that did little to warm him, he whispered the thought he had repeated for years but never said aloud, "If you loved me, you wouldn't have taken her." The storm moaned outside, but the ache in his chest was louder. The cold tightened its grip as the hours crawled by. Even with 2 blankets and his coat pulled over his shoulders, the old man felt his body trembling uncontrollably. His breath came out in shallow bursts, each one a little weaker than the last. The candle sputtered, casting jittery shadows across the walls. He tried to stand, to fetch more wood or find another blanket, but his legs buckled beneath him. The room spun. A sharp metallic taste filled his mouth. He lowered himself to the floor, leaning against the armchair where he and Margaret once sat together, reading scripture on winter nights. Now the worn fabric felt cold as stone. A heavy fog gathered in his mind, slow, numbing, irresistible. His heartbeat softened, thudding unevenly. His hands tingled, then went numb. The storm's roar faded into a distant hum, as though the world were drifting away from him inch by inch. A terrifying realization flickered through him. He might not make it until morning. His eyelids sagged. The line between waking and sleep blurred. Somewhere deep inside, a final, instinctive plea formed, unspoken, almost accidental. "Margaret, I'm so tired." And as his head drooped forward, the cold closed in, swallowing the edges of his awareness. Just as the old man's consciousness slipped into darkness, a sound, soft but unmistakable, cut through the icy hush. Someone whispered his name, not imagined, not distant, clear, warm, familiar. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. At first he thought the wind had shaped a trick of the ear, but then it came again. Henry. The voice was gentle, trembling with the same tenderness he had heard beside him for nearly 50 years, a voice he had held on to during their first dance, a voice that soothed him through every hardship, a voice he had heard breaking as she said goodbye. Margaret. His heart lurched painfully in his chest. Impossible, yet it was hers. Not younger, not older, just exactly as he remembered. He tried to raise his head. The room was dim, the candle now a tiny glowing ember. But the voice didn't come from inside the cabin. It came from the porch. "Henry, come here." He froze. Every part of him wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination born from cold and grief. But something stronger, something peaceful, wrapped around the edges of each word. With great effort, he pushed himself upright. The voice called again, softer now, like a hand reaching through the storm. And despite every reason not to believe, he whispered back, "Margaret?" With trembling hands, Henry braced himself against the armchair and pushed to his feet. The room wavered around him, but the voice, Margaret's voice, guided him step by unsteady step toward the front door. The cold stung his face as he reached for the handle. When he pulled the door open, the blizzard should have slammed into him. But it didn't. Instead, a soft, bluish-white glow spread across the porch like a veil of living light. Snowflakes swirled everywhere except within that circle of radiance. Not a single flake touched the wooden boards, and standing at the center was a woman. She wasn't quite solid, yet not transparent either, more like a shape woven from moonlight and breath. Her hands were extended toward him, palms open, as though inviting him to step closer. A gentle wind lifted the hem of her robe, though the storm around her remained untouched. Henry's breath caught. His knees almost buckled. Something deep within him recognized this presence. Not Margaret exactly, but a tenderness even purer, a compassion that pierced through his grief. The figure slowly tilted her head, her gaze filled with a love so unearthly it made Henry's chest ache. He didn't feel fear, he felt held. And the porch, once dark and frozen, now shimmered with impossible warmth. The glowing figure on the porch lifted her hands slightly, as though encouraging Henry to follow. The moment he stepped into the threshold, an unexpected warmth brushed over his skin, subtle yet unmistakable, like standing near a hearth. The cold that had been gnawing at his bones eased, just enough for him to breathe again. The woman turned, drifting toward the steps. Her shape shimmered, the bluish-white radiance rippling gently around her like the northern lights brought down to earth. Henry, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, followed her into the snow. But the strangest thing happened. Where her feet should have left prints, the snow remained untouched. Yet Henry's footprints appeared behind him, crisp and sinking deep into the drifts. The storm raged all around them, wind screaming, snow whipping in wild spirals, yet inside the halo of light everything was calm, silent, almost sacred. Henry felt a presence beside him, not pulling him, but supporting him, steadying his weakening steps. His mind, clouded by cold moments earlier, now filled with a gentle clarity he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know where she was leading him. He didn't understand why. But every instinct whispered the same quiet truth. He was being guided. And then, just as the light shifted slightly ahead, something else appeared. Two beams cutting through the storm. Headlights. The faint headlights swayed in the distance, cutting thin, wavering lines through the wall of snow. At first, Henry thought they were another illusion, another trick of exhaustion. But the lights grew brighter, steadier, sweeping steadily across the frozen landscape. The glowing woman paused at the edge of the porch light's circle, her form shimmering like a breath caught between earth and heaven. Henry took one more step toward her, just as the beam of a searchlight washed over him. A shout pierced the night. "Someone's out there! Stop the truck!" Tires crunched violently against ice. Car doors slammed. Figures in thick winter gear rushed toward him, their boots sinking deep into the snow. One of them, a young rescue worker with frost coating his beard, grabbed Henry by the shoulders. "Sir, we've been searching for hours. How did you get out here? Are you alone?" Henry turned, breath trembling, ready to explain, ready to point to the woman who had led him to safety. But the light, the figure, the presence he had followed just seconds earlier, was gone. Only snow swirled in the empty space where she had stood, untouched and strangely still. The rescue workers exchanged bewildered glances, and one of them whispered, "There's no way he walked out here by himself." The rescue workers wrapped Henry in a thermal blanket, their gloved hands brisk and urgent. Steam rose from his breath as they half-carried him toward the truck. But Henry kept glancing over his shoulder, searching for even the faintest trace of the woman in the light. "She was right there," he murmured. "She led me. She brought me out." One of the rescuers shined his flashlight across the snow. "Sir, we don't see anyone else. No tracks, no shadows, nothing." Henry pointed shakily to the ground. Look at the footprints. Mine stop right there. She was standing in front of me. The workers knelt, examining the trail. His footprints were deep and distinct, trailing from the cabin, but they ended abruptly in a wide, untouched sweep of snow, perfectly smooth, as if nothing and no one had ever stood there. The lead rescuer frowned. "That doesn't make sense. You couldn't have stopped here without falling, and there's no way you'd still be conscious in this cold." Another added quietly, "It's like someone pulled him out to us." Henry closed his eyes. His lips trembled, not from the cold, but from something breaking open inside him. For the first time in years, wonder began to overpower bitterness. Inside the heated rescue truck, Henry felt sensation slowly return to his fingers. The workers spoke in quick, practiced tones, checking his pulse, warming his hands, wrapping him in thicker blankets. But their voices seemed distant, muffled beneath the memory of the light he had followed. He stared at the frost melting on the window, watching it run in thin silver lines. Then, without warning, his chest tightened, not from the cold, but from something older, deeper. A lifetime of grief cracked open. He covered his face with both hands as sobs shook through him. The rescuers paused, unsure if it was pain or fear. One of them, a young man wearing a small cross inside his jacket, sat beside him gently. "Sir, you're safe now," he murmured. "Whatever brought you out there tonight, it wasn't meant to harm you." Henry lowered his hands, eyes red and shining. "I heard her voice," he whispered. "My Margaret. She called to me, and then there was someone else, someone full of light." The young rescuer nodded, not dismissing, not questioning, just listening. "Sometimes," he said softly, "when we think God is silent, He sends a light we weren't expecting." Henry swallowed hard. His heart, long frozen, began to thaw. Henry spent the night under observation at the small county hospital. Nurses whispered about how lucky he was. Doctors shook their heads at how close he had come to freezing. But Henry lay quietly beneath warm blankets, replaying the night over and over again. The voice, the glow, the gentle presence leading him through the storm. By morning, the snow had settled into soft, glittering hills. Christmas Eve sunlight streamed through the window, washing the room in pale gold. Henry turned his head toward it, feeling a warmth he thought he had lost forever. When he was discharged later that afternoon, he didn't ask to go home first. He asked to go somewhere else. Somewhere he hadn't dared to enter in 6 long, aching years. The church. The old wooden doors creaked softly as he stepped inside. Candles flickered along the altar. Evergreen garlands draped the pews. And there, beneath the stained glass window of the Nativity, Henry felt something inside him give way completely. He knelt, slowly, painfully, but willingly. He bowed his head, and he wept, not from sorrow, but from the unmistakable sense that he had been led back, gently, patiently, miraculously. For the first time since Margaret's passing, he whispered a prayer, not of anger, but of gratitude. And in the quiet glow of Christmas Eve, his heart finally found its way home. On a freezing Vermont night, when every hope seemed buried beneath miles of snow, a quiet light reached out to a lonely heart and led him back to life, and back to the faith he thought he had lost forever. Stories like Henry's remind us that grace doesn't always arrive with thunder or triumph. Sometimes it comes in a whisper, a gentle glow, or a presence we cannot explain, yet feel deep within our souls. And in those fragile moments, heaven draws close enough for us to breathe again. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that God still moves, still heals, still sends light into the coldest nights.
Thank you for watching Touched by Grace. Every story here is created with love, faith, and real human work. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe and stay blessed.